If you can become self-aware enough to pull back, to understand your emotions first, identify them, and then pull out of the emotion to get into your intellect, you will be able to solve problems. You will be able to self-manage. You will be able to see through the social and relationship things, because she ruined a relationship in her social environment by leaving. Welcome to the Church Hurt Recovery Podcast with your host, Soneakqua J, where we'll walk through the question, what in the church happened to you? I am a licensed professional counselor in the states of Texas and Ohio, where I work with people dealing with anxiety, depression, and religious trauma, also known as church hurt. But this is not therapy. This is a podcast highlighting social and emotional learning skills and strategies that will help you manage your thoughts, feelings, emotions, decisions, and relationships as it pertains to everyday life, but specifically for the church. If you like what you're hearing, please give us a subscribe so that you never miss an episode. Grab your water and your journal and let's jump in. Welcome back to the Church Hurt Recovery Podcast, where we ask the question, what in the church happened to you? And then we highlight social and emotional learning skills and strategies that will help you manage your thoughts, feelings, emotions, relationships, and decisions in everyday life, but specifically in the church. This is your host, Soneakqua J, and thank you so much for joining me today. So we're going to jump into this episode, and we're going to be talking about money manipulation and the church. So I am going to give you guys a scenario today. Now, this is a real scenario. I've just changed some identifying information to protect the innocent, even though I do have their permission to use the scenario. But this is one of the topics that is a hot button topic, a big issue that I'm finding in my practice, as well as amongst family and friends who have experienced church hurt by way of money giving. Now, I want to remind you that you can experience church hurt whether it's actual or perceived. And I find that when it comes to money, it's not always actual that the person is being manipulated, but it is perceived because they feel manipulated. And so if you feel manipulated, it is the same thing to you as being manipulated. So my job in this podcast is not to beat up the church or say whether or not your church leader or your church was actually manipulating you. My job is to get you to a place where you have the SEL skills and strategies that you need to make sure that you are not manipulated no matter what the church is doing. And so I am starting with an episode like this, and the category that I'm in is category 2 because it's the most common category that I have dealt with and that I see amongst people in my personal life. And remember, category 2 is the category where you or a loved one has been hurt by a church event or a series of events that happened in the church or amongst the people of the church. And money seems to be a very common, as far as the people that I work with, a common issue where we are dealing with church hurt when it comes to money. So that is what we're talking about today. So let me jump into this scenario that I want to give you, and then we'll move forward from there. And today we are not going to complete the scale. We are only going to work on self-awareness, because if you have no self-awareness, the other components really don't matter because you won't be aware enough to use them. Okay. So here is the scenario. So we're going to call this person Cadence. Cadence loved going to church. She was full of faith, growing in the Lord daily. She is or was a tither and a sower. She was a giver. She was working in the ministry and felt great about it. She had no problems with her giving. When the church announced that they were going to move to a different accounting system. Now, this accounting system was going to give the church administration, the finance team, the ability to connect your bank account to their bank account, or rather her bank account to their bank account, so that they could more easily manage the deposits. So whatever Candace was giving, they were going to make it easier for the church to just go into her account and make the transfer with her permission and with the amount that she specified. And so Cadence did not have a problem with this system. So she did give the church the permission to do this. Now, this was voluntary. This was not something that the church was mandating that everybody do. This was voluntary, and Cadence did voluntarily sign up for this new accounting system. But what she did not realize in the accounting system was that the church had the ability to withdraw from her account at will. And what she neglected to do was to give a cadence, if you will, or a permission to take it in certain areas or at certain times. So what the church did was set the withdrawals to come out every week for the same amount. So she did give permission for it to be done. She did give them the amount that she wanted set, but the withdrawal system defaulted to weekly because she neglected to identify how often she wanted the withdrawal to be done. So when she realized that this was happening every week, she went back to the finance team immediately and asked that this be corrected. And they did it immediately. They sent in the paperwork or did everything that they needed to do for this to be moved to bi-weekly, which is what she intended for this to be taken every other week when her paycheck came out. So when she went, they said no problem. They immediately, within her sight, so she saw them do this and change the system. But what neither of them realized was it was going to take the system 90 days for this to be corrected. So in the meantime, what was happening was the withdrawals continued to come out every week from Cadence's bank account. Neither of them could stop it because they had already done what they needed to do and were supposed to do. They just hadn't read the fine print that said that it would take up to 90 days for this thing to be corrected if any changes were made. So in the meantime, Cadence's bank account is going into the negative because the withdrawals are still coming out every week. So she got mad at the church because she felt like they weren't doing enough to make this right, when in actuality, they had done what they could do to make it right as far as the system. But in her eyes, they weren't doing enough. And also in her eyes, she began to feel like they had done this on purpose and they had intentionally done this to her. So what she did was left the church because she was so upset with what they had done. She left the church without saying a word to anyone in leadership. And listen, even after she received a check from the church repaying her for all the money that they had taken out erroneously, she still did not want to have anything to do with the church for sure. So she didn't return. After that, she only visited other churches, but never joined and never got back into service. So after this incident happened, she was so hurt and upset that the church would do something like this, that it ruined her from wanting to be involved with any church. And to this day, she is not involved in church. She does not tithe. She does not give anymore, and she will not commit to ministry. So listen, whatever you think and feel about this scenario, and it is a real scenario. It may not sound like it's real to you, but it is a real scenario. This is something that actually happened to a person. So whatever you think or feel about it, I know some of us will say, I never would have given them permission to go into my bank account. And you might not have, but let's not bash a person or invalidate their feelings about what you would have done. If you wouldn't have done it, great. But she's not the only one that this happened to. So let's take into account someone's actual experience and let's walk through it. So even though this may not be your exact experience, hold on. I'm not done with the types of experiences that we're going to go through. And I can almost guarantee I'm going to hit on something that you have experienced. So let's not negate anyone else's experience about what we would do. Let's just scale it. Let's just walk through it. So maybe that even if it's not you, you might run across someone who something similar has happened to or might be getting ready to experience that you could help with. But today, we're only going to look at self-awareness. So what I want you to think about, self-awareness is about how well you recognize your own thoughts and feelings about a situation. As it comes to anything, you have got to check yourself. How are you thinking? How are you feeling? And how will your thoughts, feelings, and emotions influence your behavior? Because your behavior is going to be more about self-management, which we'll talk about in the next episode. But you've got to be self-aware so that you start to understand how what you think and feel will then start to affect what you do. The ability to accurately assess your strengths and limitations. So you may have the strength and you might be saying, oh, one of my things is I manage my money well, so I would never allow someone to dip into my account for any reason. So that's a strength for you. But are there limitations in other areas for you that you might get caught up in because you saw this thing, but you didn't see this one because it's a limitation to you? And I'm using the word limitation instead of weakness. If you want to choose weakness, you can choose that or replace limitation for the word weakness. What areas are you weak in or limited in? And weakness in this situation, which is why I use limitation, doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It may just mean you're ignorant to it. You don't know about it. And guys, ignorant is not a bad word. It just means you don't know. When you're ignorant to something, you need to find out about it. Okay, so self-awareness means you know what your strengths and limitations are so that if you need to strengthen something, you can, or you just need to be around people who are not limited in that area so you can glean from them. Now, Cadence experienced joy in the church and in the ministry until she made the decision to go with the financial system that they were offering. So before this, there weren't any problems that she was recognizing. Remember, she was tithing, she was sowing, she was involved in ministry. And so when this thing happened to her, she was shocked and surprised with the weekly withdrawals. And so think about in the area of self-awareness, what was Cadence's part? Yes, there were some errors on the church's part, which is where Cadence focused so that she got hurt church hurt when it really wasn't that, was it? Let's think about it. What was her part? Did she read the fine print? Guys, when you are doing something in any area, I don't care if it's the church, you can't give your wholehearted everything to anything. You have to be self-aware that anything could happen. If you don't have enough money in your account to withstand an oopsie that somebody might make, then you have to think about, okay, I need to read the fine print. I need to make sure that I am able to handle anything that might go wrong. And this is not to blame Cadence or anybody else. This is to bring you to self-awareness. If an oopsie in your account will make you go into the negative, you need to make sure that you are aware enough to take out all the things that could happen. And we can't ever get all the things, but be aware of making decisions that if there's an oopsie that happens to your account, that you're not in the negative, that you're not going to go broke because there was a mistake. So Cadence could next time make sure you read the fine print so that if anything goes wrong, you know, ooh, it's going to take 90 days to correct this thing, or it could take 90 days to correct this thing. Can I stay afloat for 90 days if something happens, if something goes wrong in my bank account? Okay, self-awareness. So think about those things before you commit. That way you aren't disappointed or caught off guard if it does happen. And so I want to give you a mindset shift here as well. The church tried to correct the situation. So it wasn't that they were like, oh, well, too bad for you. You signed the form. You gave us permission. They didn't do that. They immediately tried to correct the issue. So then, being suspicious of the church's motives was not quite right. But that's where Cadence fell because of her emotions. She wasn't aware that what she was doing was going to cause those types of problems. And then because it did, she got in her feelings, as we say. She got emotional up behind the situation. She started getting angry. But we will talk about, yes, it was anger, but what was it underneath the anger? It was disappointment. It was fear. Oh no, my bank account is going down and even going into the negative. I am so afraid. What will happen? Can I pay all my bills? When will this be rectified? When will this be corrected? So typically, when we're not self-aware, we think that the only emotion that we can show is anger, and we ignore the other emotions that are underneath that anger, where if we would identify those emotions, we could get ourselves under control. Okay. The self-awareness for Cadence would have been, I'm hurt, I'm disappointed, I'm frustrated, I am I said disappointed, I am in fear of what is going to happen now. And so all of those emotions got wrapped up and it just turned into anger where she left the church. Okay. Was the church really trying to steal from her or really trying to deceive her? It doesn't seem that way to me, seeing that they tried to correct the situation immediately. And when the situation got corrected, they sent her a check and gave her all her money back. So that doesn't sound like someone who was trying to steal. That sounds like someone who made an error and then tried to rectify it. It wasn't in the time that Cadence would have liked for it to have been, but they did try to rectify the situation. So sometimes when you are in an emotional state, You have to become self-aware enough to know that you are in an emotional state. So emotions do not think. The emotions do not have intellect. So you have to get yourself in a relaxed and calm state by becoming more self aware of where you are so that you can think, so that you can use your intellect. Cadence might not have left the church, or she may have gone back to the church had she been able to come out of her emotion and come into her intellect to see that they actually tried to rectify the situation. What more could they have done? She might have given them some suggestions, but she didn't. She just left the church out of frustration, out of hurt, out of anger. And again, this is not to blame Cadence. This is saying that this is where she was in her self awareness in that moment, where she didn't know what else to do. So she thought leaving the church would make her feel better. It really didn't. But in those moments of emotion, when you're unaware of what is really going on with you, you will make decisions that could hurt you even worse than what you were experiencing in the first place. So scared and frustrated, she went into debt before they returned the money. But this was a part of where now, if some of you would find yourself in a situation like this, read the fine print. Make sure you can handle the downside. She saw the upsides of, making it easier for herself and the church to take her tithes and offering and her seed. But be aware that there could be a downside, and there typically is to most things that you would make a decision on. There is a downside to it. So you want to be aware of what the downside is so that you can make an appropriate decision. We're talking about self-awareness right now. Decision making is all the way at the bottom of the scale, but you can see now how these things connect. If you are not self aware, you are not going to make a great decision. You're not going to make a responsible decision, right? So if $100 banking error would send your account into the negative, you should probably avoid attaching your bank account to anything. If $100 error is going to send you into the negative, don't do it, because there's always something that could happen. Unless God specifically told you to do a thing, if you can't naturally manage that, you may want to check again with God. But if He says do it, because that means He has your back. If you didn't ask Him and you do a thing, he's not liable. He's not responsible for getting your back. He might, but he's not responsible for doing it if you did something that he didn't tell you to do. And I don't know that Cadence asked God if she should do this. She may or she may not have. But my pose to you is that you do. If you're thinking about something and it pertains to money and it could potentially send you into a negative spiral if something goes wrong, check and double check with God to make sure that He has your back on this. Another thing that I want you guys to think of for Cadence is, how are your problem solving skills? Problem solving is not necessarily a component of SEL, but when you're going to make decisions, you probably want to weigh out some problems, some potential problems that could arise if you make this decision. Can you handle the problem that could arise if you make this decision? But that again is about self awareness. Do you have accurate and appropriate problem solving skills in your tool belt? If you don't, now is the time. Was closing the account the only or the best option for her? I don't know. Being angry and leaving without a word. What if Cadence had talked to the leadership and the leadership, not the finance team, because there may be a leader on that team, but I'm talking about leadership as in the pastor or the associate pastors or anybody in the church that has a leadership role, that had you talked to them or had Cadence talk to them, they may have been able to say, hey, just give her the money back every other week until this gets rectified. The finance ministry may not have had the ability to make that decision. It may not have even crossed their minds. But when you are socially aware, you are also able to problem solve. So had Cadence gone to management, or not management, but leadership before she left the church, we don't know that leadership might have been able to make an executive decision that might have corrected her problem before she left the church. She then the finance team probably still couldn't have corrected the problem any sooner, but the leadership may have been able to rectify by saying, okay, whenever that money comes out of your account, we will give it back to you in cash or in a check so that you can put it back into your account every other week until this thing gets rectified. But because she was in her emotions and not in her intellect, that question never even came to her mind. So what I'm telling you is, if you can become self-aware enough to pull back, to understand your emotions first, identify them, and then pull out of the emotion to get into your intellect, you will be able to solve problems. You will be able to self-manage. You will be able to see through the social and relationship things, because she ruined a relationship in her social environment by leaving. She was very connected to the church. We're not going to go into all of that today, but do you see how this trickles down the scale? If you're self-aware, then you can do all the other things, including the bottom of the scale or the end of the scale, where there is responsible decision making. Okay. But it starts with this self-awareness. Okay. Leaving the church without a word really didn't help her. And she doesn't know if saying something to leadership would have helped. Now, in this particular situation, she will never know the truth, because all you can say is what could have or what would have or should have happened in hindsight. So what I want you to understand by listening to this podcast or watching it wherever you're listening or watching from, is to understand self-awareness, to be self-aware to the point where you can identify your emotions and then you can get them in check, so you can do all the other things that will help you walk down the scale, so that at the end of the scale, you can make a responsible decision that's going to help you. Listen, if someone tries to rectify the situation, no matter what is going on, think about it logically. If I intended to hurt you, but then I try to rectify it, those two things don't always go together if I'm being authentic. Now, there's another thing that where you have to be socially aware. Again, we're not talking about that completely today, but be socially aware enough to know other people. Are they going to be the person that's authentic, genuine in the situation, or are you dealing with somebody who's actually playing you? They're saying that they're going to rectify the situation or that they want to rectify the situation, but are they taking any steps? That's being socially aware. But in our self-awareness, you have to be able to reason and think about what is reasonable. Did they try to rectify this? Did they try to hurt me on purpose? When you get into your intellect and out of your feelings, you will be able to see this for what it is. So I'm going to stop here for today because we are going to continue. We're going to go into the rest of the scale in this same scenario or a slightly different scenario that might give you a better idea of how to manage the other parts of the scale. So if you enjoyed this, if you got something out of this, remember to subscribe either on Spotify or my YouTube channel or both. And remember, nothing that we say on this podcast takes the place of therapy. So, not that Cadence would have needed therapy in this situation, just some tools and skills. But if your situation has been more severe than this and you might need therapy because this is triggering you in a way, please go to therapy. There is no shame in it. So, I will see you guys on the next episode. Until then, be proactive about your mental health. Be well, and God bless. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of the Church Hurt Recovery Podcast. I hope you've learned something, and if you did, please remember to subscribe. Also, remember that this podcast is for educational purposes only. It does not take the place of therapy. So if you need professional assistance, please seek that out. Until we meet again, be proactive about your mental health. Be well, and God bless.